Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Look. Yeah, it's just my weekly podcast where we talk about books, have an author interview, and something I may be looking at. But you know, it's also our voyage of discovery. That's right. We're now beginning a voyage of discovery of new books, new authors you might not have heard of. It's a wonderful time to be reading right now, as there's so many books out there. So I hope you join me each and every week here on the podcast, be it on Apple Podcasts, be it on Spotify, or over on YouTube. We're everywhere. Anywhere you can pick up a podcast, we are there. So I hope you join us. I hope you follow us, subscribe, tell friends to do the same, because we're having a really good time. Now, today, we are joined by S.C. Gwynne. Now, S.C. is his pen name, but his name is Sam, so I'll be calling him Sam, obviously. His newest book is called His Majesty's Airship. And this is a different type of book for him because he usually writes about the 1800s. He usually writes about the American Indians or the Civil War. And this time he went over to England. We're talking about, you and I call them blimps, but they're rigid airships. And this is a fascinating story of a disaster that occurred back in 1930 when they were trying to, one gentleman, let's put it this way, was convinced they could link the British Empire with airships and travel from London to South Africa, or maybe over to India, maybe make over to Canada, Australia, etc. And his whole idea was to link the world with these airships. And we're going to talk about that and how this accident is sort of symbolic of all that's happened to the British Empire around that time. So it's a fascinating look at that. We look how there were actually two. We discuss how there were actually two airships built because the R101 that we're going to be talking about was basically the one that was given all the research, development, and everything else. And there was a sister ship built by another company, and we'll talk into all that. We'll get into the Zeppelins. That's right. The Zeppelin was named after, I think, a Count Zeppelin over in Germany. We'll get about that. Zeppelin Mania. Fascinating stuff about the history of Zeppelins and balloons and airships and what they were. And, we talk about that. We also bring in one of our favorite authors. That's right. One of our favorite authors' name is Nevil Shute. And Nevil Shute, first of all, tremendous author. And you'll hear both Sam and I discuss that. But, one of the things that Nevil was not only a writer, he was an aeronautical engineer. And he has a lot of quotes that were given about the R101, the flight plan, the problems with the airship. It's a fascinating story. It is a fascinating story of how, as late as the 1930s, no one was quite sure what was going to take over. Was it going to be airplanes or was it going to be airships? And, unfortunately for airships, they were all dying and bursting up in flames. I mean, they were having a hard time staying afloat, but they needed perfect weather conditions in order to really function right. But we'll talk about that. He's also going to talk about some other issues, why his writing style, and why he likes to write nonfiction. This gentleman was also did everything. He was a writer, editor, bureau chief, you name it, for Time Magazine. Ties into that. So this is a very interesting interview. It's a little bit longer than usual. So without any further ado, I'm going to go right into that interview with Sam Gwynne. Sam, hello. I am so honored and privileged to have you here. I have read every one of your books. I love them, and I'll tell you what, you're a wonderful writer, and appreciate you coming on today.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I'm honored that you've read the books.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I remember I was in an adult education class where the person who was leading the class was discussing your book on, I think it was Quanah Parker, the Empire. Yeah. I mean, that was the whole thing, and that got everybody hooked, and they all fell in love with the book, I think, of that. If you had a spike in sales back in 2018, that's why, because everybody was reading that. So, but anyway, you're a fascinating guy because you didn't start out to be a writer. You started out as a journalist. Could you give us a little bit about how you got into journalism? Was that what you always wanted to do? And did you have any people who you idolized, admired, that was a model for you?
Yeah, I think when I was coming up and out into the world as an adult, there were it's still, and it seems very antiquated now, but I mean, it seemed there were different tracks to being a writer, and the kind of the classic, or one of the classic tracks anyway, was the Ernest Hemingway track. And the Ernest Hemingway track was you got out of college, or in his case, high school, and you became a journalist, and you kind of honed your craft as a journalist, and then you made your way into writing fiction. That was one way to do it. The other way, which is what most people did starting kind of in my generation, was that academia gave a home to people who wanted to be writers. And so I got out of college, and what I wanted to do, I taught French for a couple of years. I went to the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins, which is, a famous writing program. John Barth was the head of it. And I wanted to write fiction. And, the track coming out of that class was, really almost everybody in the class went to academia one way or the other. And two of us actually became journalists, just because I was more attracted to the Hemingway approach. But here's the thing. Here's why I became a journalist. When I tried to write fiction, I would find myself looking at the blank page and having absolutely no idea what to do. I was paralyzed by the infinitude of choices. I could write about pink bunny rabbits on Jupiter's, or my grandfather's fishing trips, or, detective novels, or stream of consciousness. There's nothing that I couldn't do, right? But I couldn't choose what to do. There was no kind of mandate for what I wanted to write about. And I know, a lot of famous writers have this, fiction writers have this, but I didn't. Lo and behold, I got a couple of jobs in journalism, and I realized in journalism, you're working for somebody. The editor's going to make you go do those 5 stories. It's a question of what you're going to do, and what you end up doing is real. It's not I'm making up stories about whatever based on whoever. It's all real. And there, I found myself absolutely at home. This is what I'm good at this. I'm not good at fiction. I'm good at nonfiction because I'm dealing with things that are real. And it really is, over the years, I've tried to kind of go back to see if I could do fiction, and I'm no better at it now than I ever was. So, but it was great. Journalism taught me how to write nonfiction. And I had, most of my career has been as a magazine writer, the bulk of that with Time magazine.
Sam, you did everything with Time. You were the chief cook and bottle washer over there. You wrote, you edited, you were in bureau chief. So how did all that come about?
So I ended up getting a job with Time in their West Coast bureau as a correspondent. And Time back in those days, very different than what it is now. Back then we had readership of 25 million. We had, 140 correspondents around the world. Those numbers are just radically curtailed now. But it was this kind of big, muscular news organization. And, I was based in Los Angeles, Detroit, New York, Washington, Texas. And, you just get sent out on stories. Part of it was, so when I first got to Austin, Texas, one of my first jobs was to go out and cover these 2 punk kids that thought they were going to be governor, and they had a famous name, and they were Jeb Bush in Florida and George W. in Texas. So I'm flying around with these guys and driving around. And we all thought Jeb was going to win. George didn't have a prayer. We all thought we really knew what we were talking about. But, and then another story there was, a bomb goes off in Oklahoma City, and I'm up there buying my underwear at Kmart there 2.5 weeks later. So, there was news, there was features, but because it was Time, it was this, kind of constant stream of stories to do and stories to write.
Wow. I'll tell you, it's a fascinating career. But then what made you want to leave journalism and get into your own writing of nonfiction books?
Okay, so here's how that worked. It was success that did it. It was so I had I'd been working for actually a magazine called Texas Monthly, which is where I really learned to write long form fiction. They'd give me 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,000 words, and so I got much more space than I got at Time. And while I was in Texas and living in Austin, I came upon this story of this little blonde pioneer girl who had been kidnapped by Comanche Indians back in 1836, named Cynthia Ann Parker. And this whole story of how she was kidnapped and she married a Comanche chief, and her son became the last greatest chief of the Comanches. It's just some of these great stories. So I just decided I would take a swing at that. And in 2010, I published a book called Empire of the Summer Moon. And This should happen to every writer. This has become a very large international bestseller. I'm in 12 languages now, 2.5 million, more than that, copies. I mean, Taylor Sheridan is now doing a movie about it. I mean, it's everything you want as a writer. And part of that is financial. And so at that point, I decided that I had the wherewithal, financially anyway, to go into, to start writing books. So that's what I've been doing ever since. I've done some journalism during the last, I guess, however many years. This is 14 years. But mostly it's writing books. It's like, it's like everybody wants to lose the day gig, right? Whatever the day gig is, but you really want to play like electric guitar, but you can't lose the day gig because then one day you sell a million records, and now you can leave the day gig. I mean, that's kind of what it was, and I've been very happy doing this. Just it's a lot lonelier than journalism, but I'm happy doing it.
And as you said, you just didn't. You had that blank page for doing fiction writing, and that's one of the things that I've been amazed at lately is how many historians are moving over into historical fiction. What Bernard Cromwell has one, a lady over in England named Tracy Borman, gone from, she still works with history, but she does 3 of her books on historical fiction. Tom Holland, you go down the list, boom, ba boom, ba boom.
I think even, you and I were talking about Bill Brandt's HW. I think he's, I shouldn't probably say that. He's a friend of mine, but I think he is working on a novel. So historical novel.
Well, again, you and he would be perfect for doing historical novels. But again,
yeah, if only I could do it. Yeah,
if only you could do it. Well, it's one of those things. But so we'll just keep looking for you in the nonfiction and history section. Okay?
Yeah, I'm Mr. Nonfiction.
All right. Well, that's okay. Now, most of your books are set back in the 1800s. We have the book on Quanah Parker. We've got the Rebel Yell, I think it was, the Hymns of the Republic. How did you get to, and why did you want to write about R101, His Majesty's Airship?
Well, let me back up a little and just say that, these days in my business, ideas are the coin of the realm. I mean, they really are. And they're getting scarcer and scarcer and scarcer. It is so common now for me to come upon an idea for a book and to look, you do what all highly trained historians do, is you Google it, right, to see who's done this before. And I do this all the time. You think, wow, that's a great idea or something. And I've been doing it for a while. Anyway, it's so common to see a subject that has been done very sparsely, maybe once or twice in the 20th century. And then suddenly, starting in about 2002 or 3, we got 11 books. It happens all the time. Even this new book, David Grant's book, The Wager. I mean, there have been 6 books since 2014 on that. And what happens is the internet allows every schlump like me sitting at a desk anywhere in the world to instantly connect with the entire world of information about any subject, publishing history. Think of it in the old days. How were you ever going to get that? We go to New York and go to the New York Public Library. Where was one going to do that? Go to periodical indexes and thumb through them. Now it's instantaneous. And so so this idea of suddenly, a decent idea for a book, and the Lusitania, whatever year that Eric Larson, won the Derby, 6 books on the Lusitania alone. Anyway, so to me anyway, it's valuable to try to do things that aren't in currency, that aren't out there. Now, I'm the guy here with the biography of Stonewall Jackson, so okay. But nobody had done that in about 35, 40 years, so I thought I had a clear shot at that. But to go back, so how did I come up with an idea for an airship, or why would I write about it? It's just really that I found a great tale, a great story. How did I find that great tale? I was reading, have you ever read British historian named James Morris, who later became Jan Morris?
No, not familiar.
Does that ring a bell?
No, it doesn't.
Well, this will later be the key to why I have an idea that nobody else has. James Morris, as he was born, he changed his gender to Jan Morris, was just one of the finest historians I've ever read. British historian, starting, I guess, in the 70s, under the name James Morris, which is, I guess, how you find it in the library. He wrote a trilogy about the British Empire called Pax Britannica, and it's just flat brilliant. I mean, it's just great writing. It knocks me down how good it is. And it was just, because I like to read this stuff, I'm reading the 3rd volume of Pax Britannica, the Morris trilogy. There is a book called Farewell the Trumpets, the final one. And it's the end of the British Empire, basically. Churchill would be in here, and all the troubles with India and everything else, and the Boer War, and the decline of the British Empire in the 20th century. And right in the middle of this was 2 pages, I think it was 2 pages, on this airship. And the whole point of this airship was to kind of rescue the British Empire, and it became all bound up in the decline and fall of the British Empire, this dramatic crash of this airship. And it was a great tale, a much better story than the Hindenburg, which is really the only story is what made it go boom. This story is much more complicated and interesting, I thought. And also it was all bound up in a larger story, which is of, the British Empire, what was happening. Britain came out of World War II with the largest empire in the history of the world, and that started to fall very quickly. And this was part of it. So I thought it's a great story, and I always like to see, whether it's Quanah Parker or Stonewall Jackson or whoever I'm writing about, a football coach who changes the game of football. I like to see big transformations, and this checked all the boxes. So I thought, okay. And because I'm a journalist by training, I'm not some guy who's been at Oklahoma State University for 35 years working in the field of Chaucer. Academics are often, they're in their field. They stay in their field. I'm a journalist. I'm a guy who's used to whatever I do being at the bottom of somebody's birdcage on Monday night and move on from there, So go to the good idea and the good story and write about that.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly, and you are now the second airship book that I've read this year and have an author on. There's another gentleman over in England, and he was Mark Piesing. He wrote the book N4 Down. I don't know if in your research you ever came upon that. Umberto Nobile and the search for the magnetic North Pole.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. The Italian attempt.
Right, the Italian guy with.
I'm sorry. Yes, I haven't read that book, but I know the story.
Yeah, rolled a Munson. We was rolled by the end of the book.
It's a crazy story,
isn't it?
It's a kind of a crazy, wonderful, weird story. Yes, in
a way, it's sort of like this crazy, wonderful.
I wasn't aware that a book came out about it last year, but anyway, yes. Good.
It's N-4 Down by Mark Piesing. Yeah, a very good book. Yeah, enjoyable. Well, that's fascinating.
They're trying. There's a group now that is talking about anyway, and I think it might be the Airlander group that's talking about, using airships or an airship for tourism. And one of the things they want to do is, I guess, if you have a spare $500,000, they'll take you to the North Pole and put you on the North Pole. So I want to do that. I just have the problem of the $500,000.
Yeah. I'm a weight problem, so can't do that easily. Now, this one, this R101 is the brainchild of somebody who's got such a long name. I'm just going to shorten it to the Right Honorable Christopher Birdwood Thompson. Who is this guy, and what's the whole thing about?
Christopher Birdwood Thompson is kind of the hero, the center of this book. And the reason he is because he had this idea in the 1920s the idea was called became to be known as the Imperial Airship Scheme. And what he was going to do was he was going to link the world of the British Empire together through these giant, what we call rigid airships. The rigid airships had a steel structure to them, as opposed to a blimp or a balloon like N4. And these things were huge. They were 700-800 feet long, and they could lift a lot more than anything else could. And what he was going to do was sort of populate the world with these things, and he was going to connect these far-flung outposts of the British Empire, let's say Sydney or Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Egypt, Canada, all these things. His idea was that airships were going to be the future of long-range travel, which in the 20s they're still competing with airplanes for the right to kind of be considered that, because airplanes you couldn't go very far in them. They required constant refueling, and they were noisy and oil spattered, and airships theoretically, floated high above the earth and didn't need to stop to refuel. And so Lord Christopher Thompson came up with this kind of scheme that he was the one who pushed the scheme to have Britain build, using British technology, this kind of fleet of airships that would dominate the world. And they weren't competing with airplanes for short range travel. I mean, no one ever thought that airplanes were going to be good that airships were going to be good for, London to Manchester or New York to, Philadelphia. They never thought that. But transatlantic, trans-Pacific, trans-European, people did think they could. So that's what the book. So that the airship, it's the title and the subhead of the book, R101, was the flagship, was the thing that was going to prove to the world that Lord Thompson could change the world of long-range air travel. And that's what the whole thing turns out. That's a really long-winded answer, by the way, to us relatively.
You need it to figure out what's going on. He was a dreamer. I mean, he really was. He thought this was the way it was going to happen. Now, the voyage that is the central part of this, the proposed voyage, what was that going to be? Where was he going?
So he was going to take his prize airship, which was the refinement of about 30 years of technology invented by the Germans, this rigid airship technology, with all these refinements. And he was going to take this ship to Karachi, which was then in India, and from north of London to Karachi in India and back, and basically prove to the world that this new form of long-range travel was going to work. Not only that, but it was going to work with this a really luxurious, completely rethought, reimagined airship, with smoking lounges and dining rooms with formal settings and so forth. He was going to do this, and that was the idea of R101, which is the name of the airship, was going to do this. He was going to do it, and he was going to kind of return and walk into an imperial conference in London and proclaim that the future was here. He had done it. He had built it. It was just going to be nothing but people were going to look up into the air and see airships going by. Instead, the complete reverse happened. But anyway,
right. He didn't give himself a long window to do everything. I mean, he was always rather tight. I'm going to fly from here to there, meet with the royal poobah over there, come back to London in time for the conference. It was a tight schedule.
It was, and it was a very tight, and it resulted in a kind of a case of get there-itis, where this airship was launched long before it ever should have been allowed to try these things, to kind of humor his ambitions. And I should say this, that when I said that R101 was going to revolutionize air travel, if you look at the time it took between cities, you realize how revolutionary what he was proposing was. So, for example, London to Karachi was 11 days by steamer, okay? He could do it in 2. To Sydney, back in those days by sea, it was almost a month, 11 days. I mean, you're talking about completely rejiggering the time and space of within the British Empire. If something took 2 days instead of 11 or 10 days instead of 30, everything looks different in the world. Everything gets closer together. And it really was, if it could have been pulled off, it really would have been a complete revolution in travel. Now, eventually, airplanes did do that, but they couldn't do it then. They couldn't do it in 1930. And when 1930, remember, is only 3 years after Lindbergh, and Lindbergh was in some ways the exception that proved the rule. It's like you had to be crazy to fly across.
Yep. Well, now, one of the things that stuck out at me was if you were going to take one of these airships, you could only have X amount of weight on this ship. It apparently didn't bother the Right Honorable Christopher Birdwood Thompson when it came to him. Tell her what this guy brought on the ship. It's unbelievable. There
were some bits of comedy in the launch of when R101 was about to launch for Karachi. This was a 5,000-mile trip and over terrain that no one had ever gone. You're going over think Iraq and think absolutely there being nothing in Iraq and taking the airship. You're going over the empty deserts and over the Mediterranean and so forth. And he was going to do this, and weight is at an absolute premium in these things because they're lighter than air. I mean, here is a ship that weighs 160 tons that is lighter than the air in which it floats. It's lighter than a feather. And so if you suddenly put, 1,000 pounds in there, it goes down and hits the ground. Literally, that's what happens. Anyway, he brought this hugely heavy rug with him, this big old rug. He brought a trunk with him full of whatever, his papers and things, and cases of champagne. And he had, I think his luggage was 350 pounds. It exceeded the total amount of luggage of all the other people on board of the entire crew. And so he was going to load it up and get onto this airship and head for India.
Now, to begin this book, and a lot of this book is a truly fascinating writing about the history of airships. And maybe the most fascinating one is Ferdinand von Zeppelin. Who is Ferdinand von Zeppelin, and what a little about his background?
Yeah, so in the book, in order to talk about R101, I have to talk about where it came from. And where it came from was this guy, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, this a German with a magnificent walrus mustache, a military man his whole life. In the year 1900, there had been lighter-than-air things that went up in the air before. So in the 18th century, there was the first hot air balloon that went up. Balloon that could use hydrogen or hot air would be lighter than air. Problem is you couldn't steer it. It went where the wind took it. And in the 19th century, the French refined it and put a propeller and a rudder on it, so you could steer it, which it's where a name came from that people will recognize. The French verb to steer is diriger, and something that is steerable is dirigeable, dirigible. And so, but still that was just a sort of an envelope, basically a balloon filled with hot air or hydrogen. And because of that, its size was greatly limited. Because its size was greatly limited, the amount that you could lift was greatly limited. And if you couldn't lift more than a couple of guys and a dog, I mean, how useful was it going to be? Okay, 1900, this lifelong military guy, Ferdinand von Zeppelin, invented the rigid airship, which meant he had a steel structure. Think of it like a bird cage or a Chinese lantern or something, around which there was dope cloth wrap. The advantage of this is that you could build it much, much bigger, and it wouldn't collapse on itself, and you could fill it with huge hydrogen-filled gas bags that would allow you to lift a lot. So his first ship was 450 feet long. R101 was 777 feet long. That's 3.5 football fields. So it's huge. So when von Zeppelin came up with this, and then he tried. So this is right around the time that the Wright brothers were flying, right? There was a competition between planes and airships in those days. And there was one moment where I think the count had been up for 12 hours continuously with 8 people on board. And the best the Wright brothers had been able to do was like 38 minutes with Orville on board. I mean, it was a competition. And it even looked as though the airship might be winning it, certainly for long-range travel. And the count tried various, there was a lot of kind of comical, but also tragic, early experimentation in aviation with both airships and airplanes. The Count's first few attempts failed miserably. He was mocked and he was made fun of. Finally, I think it was 1906, he came up with something that could actually stay up there and not crash and not go up in a hydrogen fireball. And he became this, when he became this phenomenon. I mean, there was this Zeppelin Mania that swept through really all of Europe, but especially through Germany. And of course, Zeppelin was his name, but it was the word that came to designate, the airship. And, when Zeppelin Mania hit, it was like, there was candies and clothing and cigarettes and chocolates all named after him, and flowers named after him, streets, schools. It was just this total kind of, one of the reasons for that is the Zeppelin itself was such a thing to behold. I mean, it's 600 feet long and lighter than air. I mean, nobody could believe it. It introduced kind of a whole new concept to humanity that these things could exist. And that Zeppelin concept is, if we've all seen the Hindenburg, that is a Zeppelin built by. That's on the Zeppelin model. Pretty much all the big airships. All the big airships were built on the Zeppelin model, steel frame, hydrogen or helium gas bags inside them so that they could lift things. But the key thing that you have to understand about the Count is, so if you ask the question, why did the Count build these airships, or what was the point? Was he intending to have an airline? No. A cargo carrier? No. He had one and only one intention for these ships, and that was weapons of war. He wanted to bomb the hell out of European cities and kill innocent people. And this was we're coming up on World War I now, so it's very much in the martial spirit of Germany itself. And indeed, Zeppelins in World War I became the world's first long-range bombers, first weapons of mass terror. They became the first time that humanity understood it could be annihilated from above by something other than a thunderbolt. when the waves of Zeppelins came across the English Channel to bomb London and various other cities in England. I mean, this was just absolute terror. And in the early war, the British had absolutely no defense against it. So anyway, the whole kind of basis for this was Zeppelins. And when the world first really knew about them was in World War One as bombers, as a weapon.
It's fascinating. This guy took a tragedy, which was called, I guess, the Miracle of Echterdingen, and turned it into Zeppelin Mania, and everything started to change. Now, but, you know, you and I, and anybody else who reads this book, is obvious that this whole trip that began for the R101 was pretty much fraught from the beginning with, when they decided to take off, was problematical. But then you quote one of my favorite writers, Nevil Shute, who says, yeah, things were different back then. How were they different? In the sense that we were going to take off even if there's bad weather or even if there's all these problems. There's different in mentality with the people back then?
Yeah, it was. The premise for what, and I love Nevil Shute too, the premise for what he was saying was that airships were inherently extremely dangerous things. I mean, they were phenomenally difficult to fly, way more difficult than an airplane. They were just so subject to wind that if they were even near the ground in a wind, they'd be beaten to pieces. And then what would usually happen is a spark would hit, and then you'd see this giant fireball, just like the Hindenburg, which happened about 75 times, by the way. There were 75 fireballs like the Hindenburg. We only saw one of them. But there's inherently dangerous. There's a lot of problems with them. There always were. The cover was very flimsy. The gas bags you could put your finger through, and they also blew up. I mean, it went on and on and on. And so the question is, why do you keep trying something that is such a dangerous and inherently flawed technology? And Nevil Shute's answer was that, as you say, particularly coming out of the First World War, there was just a much higher tolerance for risk. You know, and if you just look at the history of aviation in the early days, I mean, just look back at the old films that we all used to see, right, of all the comical planes going to. These were people that were willing to go out there and get in that machine and try it. You know, and you know, in a way that, I mean, who wants to go up with Chuck Yeager in the X-1 and try to break the sound barrier? You know, there aren't a lot of people who want to do that. But Nevil Shute's comment was that who was an engineer who worked on R101 sister ship, was that times were just different back then. There was a higher tolerance for risk. Because you look back now and you say, no, you wouldn't do this. You wouldn't persist for 40 years with this one technology after virtually every single rigid airship ever made crashed, which was...
Yeah, he even went in to criticize the testing of everything and all the accidents and the failures. He really ripped into the R101, you know, in your book for what you were saying. Where did you find his quotes? Was that in a governmental hearing or something? Nevil Shute's opinions about R101 are famous in England. And because he was so hard on the building of R101, and as I say, he was unfair to some extent, and to some extent he was dead on. But because he was one of the greatest British writers of the middle 20th century, when he was saying these things, particularly in his autobiography, he said that it was given great weight. I mean, there were two great critics of R101 in England as time went by: Barnes Wallis, one of the most famous engineers of the 20th century, and Nevil Shute, one of the most famous writers, whose book I read on the beach when I was 14, changed my life. But so everybody knows about what Nevil Shute said, and it's been a huge piece of controversy. And one of the first things that people, when I went and talked to the British airship community when I first was researching this, one of the first questions they all asked me is, what do you think of Nevil Shute? In other words, are you just going to be a mouthpiece for more of that crap that he talks about R101? Yeah. What happened? Well, now, you know, the other thing that was interesting was that in order to get the R101 built, the Lord Honorable Wright, whatever his name is, Thompson, had to agree to a second airship being built. That's the R100. What's the difference between the two?
So the Imperial Airship Scheme, which is this big scheme to, you know, bolster up the British Empire, which after World War I is the largest empire in the history of the world, but creaky at all of its edges. India, and we'd seen Iraq and Palestine, and of course the Boer War had already happened. But it was to sort of bolster the empire with the Imperial Airship scheme. Yeah, it actually ended up being 2 airships, and this was hatched in the middle 1920s. Thompson was a socialist. He was one of the first labor. He was the Secretary of State for Air in the first Labour government in British history. These were the lefties, the communists, the socialists, the people, not so much communists, but they wanted to, state ownership of all the means of production, those guys. And so Thompson set up this system whereby there would be 2 airships. One is the socialist airship, which was R101, which was basically cost plus forever. Whatever you want, you got it. And then there was the R100 and sister ship that was basically told fixed contract, built by a private contractor, Vickers, and just shut up and build it for that amount. And Thompson's baby was always R101 that had all the radical new technology on. It was part of the problem of, there were so many problems in the building of these airships, but one of the biggest ones was that Thompson did that, I guess, to placate the capitalists maybe, but by doing it, he split this very small British airship community into 2. There was hardly any British expertise in building airships. The Germans had it all. And he split that community in 2 with Barnes Wallis, incidentally, the famous engineer on the side of R100. So he crippled it in many ways from the very beginning by having 2 ships. R100, by the way, went across the Atlantic and back with a series of incredible near misses and near mishaps, but it did just before R101 tried to make India and crashed.
One of the things that is overriding this whole thing is something called the Graph Zeppelin. And that makes an appearance in your book, the German rigid airship, which I thought were going to be outlawed by the Treaty of Versailles. Didn't happen, did it?
Well, what happened was, coming out of World War I, the Germans, of course, had used the Zeppelins, as I said, they bombed 7 cities in Europe, and they bombed the hell out of England. They weren't very successful at it, but they created terror. And so coming out of World War I, you did have the Treaty of Versailles, which absolutely forbid the Germans to build any more of these things, period. Now, the Germans tried to get around that in various ways that I won't go into, and they managed to launch a couple of smaller ones that were then outlawed. And they built one for the Americans as a reparation officially. Eventually, the rules slacked enough so they were able to build this one particular Zeppelin, a pretty big one called the Graph Zeppelin, Graph meaning count. And this thing was launched in 1928. And the interesting thing about it was that its crew was all of the very best of the Germans. It was the 1927 Yankees of airship. I mean, it was just, airships were so hard to fly. These guys were the Germans had flown so many missions in World War I. They'd built so many dozens and dozens of Zeppelins as opposed to a few for the British, like 2 for the Americans. They had so many. They had this incredible expertise, and they put it to use in the Graph Zeppelin, which was a standard rigid airship filled with hydrogen airbags, and they sailed this thing around the world. And there was a moment, I think in 1928, when there are only 2 airships left in the world. I mean, they've all crashed. But the Graph is out there flying around, to South America, fly across the United States, fly across Trans-Pacific, and everybody would point to it and say, see, no, it's really a great idea. Meanwhile, there are thousands, tens of thousands of airplanes flying commercial routes, but there's one airship, but hey, it can do it. It was part of this oddball optimism that everybody continued to have about airships. And the Graph story, the Graph itself had some stories that I tell. The near misses and the near catastrophes were many, but somehow it made it, and it became a thing. In fact, the captain, Ugo Ecknat, who was the heir to Zeppelin, took over the Zeppelin company, was at one point the most famous aviator in the world, flying this thing around the world. It's part of it's kind of a crazy sub-story of the airship world.
It's interesting. I've been talking to another gentleman, and I had been unaware of this. Back in 1925, the British government developed a plan for evacuating the children from London and the cities because they didn't trust the Germans. And they had a feeling that there was going to be a bombardment no matter what. And I didn't realize that those plans were hatched so long before
No,
1939.
I didn't know that either.
No, fascinating. And then that tied in with me saying, and there goes the Graph Zeppelin floating all around the place, you know. Yeah.
Which eventually had a swastika on its tail, as did the Hindenburg and as did the Graph Zeppelin too. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people think of London as being, you know, the bombing of London as happening during the Battle of Britain and so forth, which it did, absolutely. But the first bombing was by Zeppelins in World War I. So whatever the thinking in 1925, the British had been bombed.
Mm-hmm. That's
before.
right.
And, you know, they called them baby killers. They didn't kill very many British people, but they came at night and, you know, these things, bombs coming out of the sky, and they were terrifying.
Yeah, they were. We got to get to the actual flight of this, you know, or we've talked a lot about the back of it. The actual flight itself, what happened? I don't want you to give away all this going on, but what basically happened to this flight?
Right. So the airship, the airship is at its mast in Cardington, about an hour north of London. It's up there, and it's going to take off October 4th, 1930. And it's got, its crew of 54, total 54 people on board. And it's going to Karachi, which is a 2-day trip. The first day will get them to Ismailia in Egypt, and the second day will get them to Karachi, which was then in India. And again, this was going to be the showpiece that was going to prove to the world that this could be done, this kind of thing, and be done in luxury and in safety. And anyway, so Thompson and everybody board the airship. There's a rising storm. The guy who's got the go, no-go call is one of the most famous airship captain in England, named Herbert Scott, who's unfortunately a dipsomaniac drunk who can't be trusted after noon. He has the call. The storm is rising, and the ship takes off into the storm. It's headed first for Paris, and then it's going to turn south to the Mediterranean and then east toward Egypt. It's going to happen. The ship makes it about 7.5 hours. It's an interesting and chronicle, but the book is is balanced between the narration of that flight and what happens on it, which is interesting stuff. And the backstory, which includes von Zeppelin and all this interesting stuff that leads up to it. And there's a moment when they're crossing the English Channel. There's a real storm, so they're kind of being bumped around, but they're all, the guests are all up there in the smoking lounge now, enjoying their cigars and their sherries after their luxurious dinner, or out on the promenade, they're seeing the sparkle of lights from France as they hit the French coast. And the wire operator sends a final wire. Well, didn't know it was a final wire, but a wire back to Cardington saying, everything's great. We're doing great. They had a wonderful dinner, enjoying their cigars, and now they're going to bed because they're tired. And they got about an hour to live. But suffice it to say that the problems that were always ignored during the building of R101 had to do with the cover, which is just think of linen or cotton, pretty thin sheets of it that were just wrapped over the frame. That's what it was. They had some airplane dope on it to keep it, waterproof. Covering up gas bags that held 5.5 million cubic feet of hydrogen, which were made of cow intestine. So incredibly fragile things, both of them. So you had the steel structure, which was pretty strong, and these unbelievably fragile covers, which would keep tearing. And once the cover tore, then the gas bags were at the mercy of the elements. And if the gas bags ruptured, then hydrogen went out into the air, which not only mean you lost lift, but the thing could blow up. Anyway, the weaknesses in R101 are all related to things that the builders ignored their safety inspectors. Basically, the strength of those two very weak parts of the airship.
One of the most fantastic numbers you have in the book is that 500,000 cows from down in, I think, Argentina gave their lives for their intestines to be used.
It was amazing. You think, so why are you using cattle intestines to do this? And the answer is that hydrogen is the lightest element, and it tends to get out from wherever you put it. It just squirts out, sneaks out. And even though the chemists and whoever they were, biologists, worked with many different possible envelopes, the only one that was truly impermeable or as close to impermeable as you could get was an animal intestine. Now, when I say that, you just think sausage casing. That's what it was. So now imagine a 10-story high piece of sausage casing, literally, not exaggerating, 10 stories high, containing 500,000 cubic feet of hydrogen. It basically consists of these squares, about a foot square, of cow cecums, the part of the intestine, glued onto a thin cotton backing, and then all glued together into these giant, they look like cheese wheels. And that's what made it go up. And again, workmen used to fall through the gas bags because they would drop something and fall right through, or the wrench would fall through it. They were not only incredibly vulnerable to wind, but they were incredibly vulnerable just themselves based on the substances that they were made out of.
Unbelievable. We could go on. I have a raft of more questions to talk to you. Fascinating, gentlemen. But, bottom line is, I think when they got to it, the thing crashed. We know that. Almost everybody died. There was an official investigation. Sort of they wanted to sweep the whole thing under the rug, didn't they? Didn't want to pin it on anybody.
They did. They concluded that no one was to blame, when in fact all sorts of people were to blame. And what they did, one of the greatest documents I discovered at the National Archives in Kew, west of London, was the actual minutes of the inquiry. They had an inquiry, and they called everybody in. They called in dozens of witnesses, and they went through in great detail and pretty adversarial interviews. It's great, just 750 pages of tiny print, goes on and on and on and on. And it's great. And the truth of R101 is pretty much in there with a few exceptions. But what they did is they then took this document that absolutely nobody read and put an executive summary out that said, hey, everything's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it was because it was seen as such a national tragedy. It was the biggest thing since the Titanic. You had 1 million people in Whitehall for the funeral cortege. I mean, it was such a thing. And there was, even though only 48 people died, which is more than the Hindenburg, but it wasn't the number of people who died. We just came out of a war where 750,000 British subjects died. So it wasn't that. There was something about the ambition, something about the thing. It was just a true national tragedy. And the point of covering it up was nobody was in any mood to point the finger at Thompson, who was incinerated alive, and go, hey, I was you. Because all these guys died in horrible ways. And, there was no mood for that at the time. And there was nobody who said, yeah, let's hold this guy up to blame who died in a horrible hydrogen.
It's symbolic of what was happening in the British Empire, all crumbling down, didn't it? All went up in flames.
It's a great symbol of the beginning or the end.
Now, I don't want to have people rushing to Google, okay? But what are you doing next? Do you have anything on the horizon? And we don't want to have people steal your ideas and get a book out there before you do, okay?
I don't. To answer that question, I usually have a book that I'm already working on. I don't at this point. And the truth is, I honestly don't have anything that I've decided to do or for which I have a contract. And that's the honest truth. There were some things that I ran into writing about the Civil War that I may go back to that. But I don't know. We're going to have to. It's an interesting place to be for me because I'm normally grinding forward into the next thing. So,
are you doing any of the screenwriting for the movie on the Quanah Parker?
No. I will be the guy who sold the rights. And so what we've just done is there's this guy named Taylor Sheridan who does Yellowstone and 1883 and 1923, and he's done movies. Anyway, he's kind of a big deal in Hollywood, but he's also a Western guy who lives in Texas, owns a big ranch, deals in horses. He's really a great person, I think, to do Empire of the Summer Moon, which various Warner Brothers in particular has been trying to do for the last 12 years. So we'll see what happens. But I'll be the guy who sold the rights.
They're not going to bring you out and be the head of whatever, some department or some historical expert. No, nothing.
I told Taylor on the phone that I wanted to have a role as like when the Comanches would raid or leave dead people. I wanted to be like a dead, bloated sod buster, like that they discover a week after the raid. And he promised. I'm going to hold him to it. We can do the bloating in post production. He said.
Ted Turner did the same thing with Gettysburg. Ted Turner said, I want to be in Gettysburg, and they made him as a soldier marching in line for
I didn't
2
know
seconds. That. Yeah, he was in that too. So anyway, wow, this has been a lot of fun, Sam. I have just enjoyed the heck out of this, and what a great book. Friends, if Christmas is coming, you want to get this book. This is a great book. It's got history. Unfortunately, it's got some humor involved in the whole thing too, and there's a Romanian lady who I had a chance to get to. My wife was very interested in that because she's a Romanian, and we'll get into all this stuff. But, Sam, you have been an absolute pleasure to be with, and thank you so much for coming on Books and Looks.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great talking to you and great questions. Good interview. Thanks.
Very good. Friends, we'll be right back after a minute. Well, once again, thanks so much, Sam, for a really informative interview. Folks, I hope you get a chance to pick up his book. It's a fascinating look at airships and the whole problem that occurred back there in 1930. I learned so much about this, and I think you're going to really find this a very fascinating book. Anyway, because we're on a little long today, I'm not going to do any looking or anything else. I'm just going to say to you, hey, on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, the good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.